So this is part 2 of our video on stereotypes, prejudice and discrimination. In this video we're going to focus on sexism and heterosexism. Hetero-whatism? Don't I mean homophobia? No, I don't, and nor should you. Want to know why? Well, I'll tell you in this video, amongst other things. We know that psychologists have largely neglected the role of the social, economic and political systems in the theories we've developed to understand human behaviour. Rather, our field, consciously or unconsciously, has been instrumental in upholding the status quo by leaving that socio-economic context unexamined. In relation to gender, psychology has historically accepted and even perpetuated exploitation and marginalisation of women. In relation to sexuality, psychology has in the past actively promoted the idea that being gay was abnormal. So let's kick off with gender. Now, for much of its history, psychology has failed to challenge ideas about women's roles, the damaging stereotypes about women. Here's what we know about women. Oh, and by the way, all of that's not an effect of women being less intelligent than men, or less enterprising than men, or less hard-working than men. George Monbiot delightfully summed up this in the situation here when he said, "If wealth was the inevitable result of hard work and enterprise, every woman in Africa would be a millionaire." Now, why are women less successful in business and less represented in positions of power than men? Maybe it's because they're mentally unstable. No, whoa, hold on. Calm down. Let me explain by drawing on the social context of women's lives. Now, 1 in 4 women have experienced rape or attempted rape, and such experiences are powerful predictors of psychiatric treatment. Poverty and levels of deprivation are much higher among women than men, and the links between poverty and psychological distress and disturbance are well documented. Poverty amongst women is strongly associated with being a single parent, being divorced, being old, being black, or being a member of an ethnic minority group. So those other social identities are intersecting here. And in response to the appalling circumstances in which many women live, the mass media, particularly television, constantly explains that things are the way they are and must be, and that in any way there are all kinds of ways to have fun through consumption and waste. The tensions that result from exploitation can be relieved by headache remedies, antacids, laxatives, and tranquilizing medicines that reduce anxiety. Now, women are the major consumers of these products, and all of this helps explain why women are more likely to experience distress and come to the attention of psychology, particularly clinical psychology. They come to psychology as though they're the gender that has the problem. But there's another side to this. Women are also more likely in general to have their thoughts, feelings and behaviours defined as signs of madness, more so than men in general. Now, in Western medicine, hysteria was the word used to describe or redescribe as a mental illness what are normal biological functions of a woman. The American Psychiatric Association did drop the term hysteria in 1952, largely as a result of the efforts of the women's movement, but it was there. Indeed, psychology's response to women's exploitation has been and continues to be challenged through the efforts of the women's movement, but it's taken a very long time for the women's movement to push oppressive theories and practices out of psychology. Now, here are some of the problems that remain with us today. Men are taken as the standard and the norm from which women deviate. Men decide what's worth investigating and how it should be investigated. And there's a bias to publish the results of studies that show a difference between the genders. Also, results regarding gender differences are regularly interpreted in line with stereotyped expectations. Now, here's an example of how sexism in psychology is operated. This is a paper published in 1968 known as the Bystander Apathy Effect paper. Most psychology students are familiar with this paper, but what many don't know is that all of the participants in that piece of research were male undergraduate students, Why don't they know this? Are they bad students? Are they just inattentive? No, they don't know it because of a bit of linguistic trickery contained in the paper. Let's see how this happens. Let's see how this is done. So, here, see how a group of 50 male undergraduates, within the space of a paragraph, just become a group of people. You know, the fact that all of the participants were male gets lost, and suddenly we find the study is generalized to everyone, men and women. This is the process by which psychology's knowledge of what it means to be human is built on the male experience of what it means to be human, and then this is kept hidden from view. And this has happened a lot in psychology, and you need to keep an eye out for it. It happens less these days, but still you need to keep an eye out for it. So in episode 13, I talked about how women have been airbrushed out of psychology through how their contribution has not been properly acknowledged in the history of psychology. Now, is this still the case? Are women still not being recognised? Well, here's what the American Psychological Association's Committee on Women in Psychology reported in 2017. I've put the link to this report in the YouTube description box below. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put the link up on the Moodle site as well. If I forget to, just go to YouTube, look at the description box. Moodle's just for the enrolled students. If you're not enrolled, don't worry about Moodle. It's not Noodle. Not as nice as Noodles. But as stringy as Noodles. Okay. So this is what they said. Women are underrepresented in positions of academic, institutional and scholarly influence in psychology, despite receiving more psychology doctorates than men. And women also take on average a year longer than men to attain tenure. Tenure just means a permanent contract. So that was the American Psychological Association Committee of Women in Psychology in 2017. And they've said, although the proportion of women ad hoc reviewers involved in the scientific review process of APA journals increased from 14% in 1994 to 40% in 2013, the proportion of women editors of APA journals increased from 11% in 1994 to only 18% in 2013. Thus, while more than 1 in 3 APA ad hoc peer reviewers are women, fewer than 1 in 5 APA journal editors are women. Now, what does all this mean? Well, reviewers are the people who look at the journal papers in academic journals and decide whether they are worth publishing. So ad hoc reviewers are where academics like me get sent a journal article to review. We give the journal editor our view of whether the paper should be published or not, and journal editors are the ones who ultimately decide if the paper will be published, to go into the next edition of the journal or not. So as such, the ad hoc reviewer has relatively little power, and the journal editor has a lot of power in deciding what gets published in academic journals. And there are more men in editor roles than women. There's a very big gender difference still. We can see other evidence of this gender inequality here in this quote. In the US, women hold 45% of the faculty positions in psychology departments, up from around 24% in 1983, but it's much lower than the 70% in terms of proportion of students. In regard to tenured positions, the split was 61% men versus 39% women. So women's participation is increasing, but still not equal. So what we're finding in psychology, and this is true in many areas of science, but I think particularly pointed in psychology, given how many women now study psychology, is two things. One is horizontal segregation. So this is where women are concentrated in subfields that are deemed appropriate to their presumed nature. And we also have hierarchical segregation. This is where women occupy positions of lesser status with lower incomes and fewer opportunities for advancement. In fact, the interesting thing is that we might see this horizontal segregation more generally in terms of how many women come into psychology, because maybe people see psychology as a caring profession. That process where opportunities for women's employment are largely created in sections of the workforce that are deemed more aligned to women's nature, carers. But when they enter psychology, and you might have an experience of this, when they enter psychology, they find it's actually been constructed by men. You might not know this or be able to understand this when you initially come in, but that's one way of making sense of it. It's been constructed by men. And the signs of it are that it's not actually the type of caring profession that you maybe thought it would be. Ever noticed how little time you spend on developing your working with people skills, and how much training you've had in hard science and statistics and learning laboratory experimental protocols? You're studying the hard sciences, and it seems to be less about, those caring skills, working with others. Ever wondered why? Ever wondered why you were surprised? Not all of you will be surprised, but some of you, I imagine, would have been surprised when you first came into psychology. You didn't expect all of the stats, and you didn't expect all of the laboratory work, maybe. Wondered why? Well, maybe it's because it's constructed by men. Let's end with sexuality, to talk about sexuality. And I want to raise some issues and some questions for you that, if you're enrolled in this unit, will help you feed into assessment 3, if you choose to write about sexuality. Now, if you're not enrolled in the unit, the issues and questions are useful for their own sake, I hope. Now, let's first nail down some of the key terms. Homophobia. This is the pervasive social condition which is often experienced as anger, disgust, and discomfort with homosexual people, and may be demonstrated in both verbal and physical violence against them. Now, recently, scholars have argued against the use of the term homophobia for 2 reasons. First, anti-gay attitudes do not take the form and meaning of a phobia, in a clinical sense. Second, such a term emphasizes the individual rather than the social aspect of anti-gay prejudice, thus disregarding cultural ideologies and intergroup relations. The other problem is that homo means male, so it's a bit wonky, a little bit sexist. Now, heterosexism has been defined as the ideological system that denies, denigrates, and stigmatizes any non-heterosexual form of behavior, identity, relationship, or community. Others have defined heterosexism as the belief in the moral superiority of institutions and practices associated with heterosexuality. Now, what has psychology said about being homosexual or being gay? Well, things didn't start off well. Particularly in the area of psychoanalysis. This was at the turn of the 20th century, it means 1900s, early 1900s. Here we have Freudian psychoanalysis, and the idea here was that homosexuality derived from an arrest in normal psychosexual development. So homosexuality was seen as abnormal, and this reflected the views of society at that time. And this became solidified in the 1950s when homosexuality was classified in, and you guessed it, in our friend, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in its first edition. Being gay was defined as a mental illness. Now, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the DSM in 1973. One story is that science rescued gay people after it was found that there was no empirical evidence existing that warranted labeling homosexuality as a mental illness. The other version, the one I believe, is of a story where it was removed from the DSM following intensive pressure from the gay movement. That's probably more credible, but maybe it's a little mix of the two. But the pressure from the gay rights movement was enormous and certainly did impact things. Now let's talk about conversion therapies. This may help us make sense of why people in the LGBTIQ movement have sought to establish sexuality as biological. Conversion therapy is the attempt to change a gay person's sexuality through therapeutic techniques, to put the person through a program through which they will learn not to be gay. These therapeutic techniques are practiced by religious organizations and by healthcare professionals. And conversion practices, they're not explicitly prohibited under legislation in Australia. We don't like them happening, they still go on. But the Australian Psychological Society has come out and said, we disagree with this stuff, we shouldn't be doing this stuff. So existing laws and regulations that govern medical professionals and healthcare services do provide some important protections. More and more of these professions have come out and said, stop doing this conversion therapy. You know, it's wrong. Stop treating being gay as something that needs to be corrected. The conversion therapy gives you an insight of why there's been this shift with people saying it's not something that we've not learned to be gay, we were born gay. Maybe in response to this idea through conversion therapy that people can unlearn being gay. They can learn to become heterosexual. Just to give you some fine detail on this, so in 2015, the Australian Psychological Society issued a formal position statement opposing gay conversion therapies. Thank goodness. So, we're getting better in psychology, but the mainstream approach to psychology that holds a notion of the self that is independent from others and disconnected from the social environment does the biggest disservice to gay people. So think how we might approach the issue of why lesbian and gay relationships tend to be short-term relationships. We've sort of found this in research. Now, if we focus in at the individual level, we might conclude something about the maladjustment to relationships of gay people. So if in social psychology we interpreted social at the small group level, an interaction between two people, we might get those answers. You know, there's something dysfunctional about the individual in terms of how they're able to establish a relationship. But what if we interpret social as meaning large group or societal? Well, then we get this. So with basic rights unprotected, except in exceptional circumstances, and with continuing resistance to their equitable treatment, mounted by social and religious conservatives, lesbians, gay men and bisexual people constantly engage in coping processes to ensure the safety of their personal lives. The difficulties these people experience in the formation and maintenance of committed relationships, historically attributed to their characterological defects, can be seen as resulting from the destabilizing and delegitimizing societal forces which dispense no symbolic or concrete support to such relationships and actively discourage their existence. So that was D'Aguila in 2000. So the risk of social psychology is that if we retain a focus on the interpersonal dynamics, the small group, the very small group, the dyad, the interaction of two people, and define that as social and be preoccupied with that, which a fair part of psychology and social psychology has been solely fascinated with, if we stick with that level, we become blinkered to those wider political and cultural contexts that help to shape the very dynamics of the behaviour that we're observing. Now, I want to end with a bit of a suggested reading, a fascinating story that illustrates some problematic ways that gender and sexuality can interact and why, if you're a gay man, you're not necessarily a friend of women. Now, I've put a copy of this paper on our Moodle site under week 6, under the title Other Stuff. If you're not enrolled on the unit at CQ University, then I've put the full reference to the paper in the description box so you can go and try and find it for yourself. The reason I'm providing the paper just to the students is because of copyright issues and so on, but also, hey, there has to be some sort of benefit to students paying their unit enrollment fees. You know, they've got to get something for it. Okay, so that's all for now. Till next time. Ta-da.